Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also Philip Cunliffe in London and George Hoare, also in London, though he's away today.
Philip Cunliffe in Canterbury. George Hoare's away, but in London.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, I hope everyone's keeping track. Also in London, someone who is my next door neighbor practically when he's in São Paulo, but he's in London right now, is Vincent Bevins. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me again. Good to be back.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you back. For listeners who aren't familiar, Vincent was back on in, a little while ago, episode 121, where we discussed his excellent book, The Jakarta Method. And today we're going to be discussing protest. His new book, it's very good. It's called If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. Now, listeners may not be aware, but the 2010s really was a decade of protest. And that might be surprising because there is more protest than ever. And yet these aren't meant to be the most political times of all of history. And yet seems to be probably more protest now globally than at any other point in human history. So that maybe seems kind of paradoxical. And we're going to explore that as we go forward. But Vincent, first of all, you covered a huge amount of ground in this book in terms of geography and time. It's obviously limited to about a decade, but certainly in terms of like the places you covered, it's a lot. I think 10 countries, correct me if I'm wrong: Bahrain, Yemen, South Korea, Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, Brazil, Ukraine, Hong Kong, and Chile. And probably the last group there were the ones that garnered the most focus, I think. So maybe to start off, tell us a little bit briefly. I guess you were working in Brazil. You were a reporter here at the early part of the 2010s. But maybe reflecting across all of them, what was your favorite country to do the research for this book in?
Wait, did you say South Korea? I think you might have missed South Korea.
I did South Korea. No, I got South Korea.
Got it. So you got all of them. Yeah. So I did interviews in 12 countries, and then I end up ultimately deciding that 10 episodes are really what I'm looking at, which is mass protests that get so big that they either dislodge or fundamentally destabilize a given government. And so what I try to do, stupidly, ambitiously, is to try to build a history of the world from 2010 to 2020 around that particular phenomenon and act as if it is the most important thing in the decade. I think you might as well build a history around that phenomenon as much as anything else. And I kind of build I build the story as if Sao Paulo is the center of the world. I think you might as well, just as much as
I feel like it every day.
Yeah. Most books that come out in the United States treat New York as the center of the world. Like you might have, Sao Paulo maybe has a lot more in common with, there's only really one country like the United States, but there's a lot of countries like Brazil. Maybe we'll get to that. But so I put Brazil at the center, but that wasn't like interesting or new. So the countries that I liked reporting in the most, I don't know if I'm saying this just because they're at the beginning or because this is in the news now, but I think in Tunisia and Egypt, I had really interesting experiences. Very different ones. In Tunisia, you could really do the type of reporting that I'm used to. Things have sort of fallen apart since the initial success of the revolution that started in 2010. But you could still go there and identify discrete actors and talk to them. So not only did that revolution actually have different identifiable groups that were active in identifiable ways, you could, when I was doing the reporting for the book starting in 2021, go sit down with them. So I met the family of Mohamed Bouazizi, the man who self-immolated in the center of the country in late 2010. I met with the Hojaist Communist Party, which was quite influential in getting protests off the ground in the region. I met with the large union structure that was really important in making the revolution happen. I met with Ennahda, which is their sort of Islamist, or they would like to say maybe post-Islamist political party. So in Tunisia, you could go all of their categories are recognizably Western as well, because there's so much intellectual back and forth with France. Like the two really radical parties in Tunisia, I always liked this, were founded as the result of a French language journal called Perspectives. So everything was like the kind of reporting that I was able to do was fun and was the type of professional work that I'm used to. But then Egypt was fascinating for precisely the opposite reason. Like you couldn't do reporting at all. It was insane to be in Cairo and to be reporting, even in like a very broad way about.
And this is like in the recent years. I mean, I guess you were there, whatever, over the past couple of years, right?
I was there in 2021. Ironically, well, not ironically, I was there in 2021. The last time Gaza was bombed by Israel. And even though I wasn't like trying to like crack the story wide open of the 2011 revolution or the 2013 coup that installed Sisi, you just couldn't do any reporting at all. So people would tell you, if you're in public, especially in the center of Cairo, and you're talking about politics, someone will call the cops and you'll get arrested. And people told me, okay, I know you've met this guy and I know you met this woman, but they're spies. And then those people would say, no, they're spies. And everyone would say, all these people that are spying for the state don't want to, but they're being forced into spying for the state because they have a relative in jail or somebody that they know that's in jail that is being used as leverage against them. So it was like the most intensely like oppressive regime that I had ever experienced. And you couldn't even do any reporting at all, but I found that interesting in a way that it had come like at the end of this, I think undeniably incredibly inspiring revolution in 2011. By 2021, you like couldn't even talk about politics on the streets. Like cops would just like grab your phone, look through your camera roll, and if there was anything that seemed vaguely political, you'd go to jail. If you had signal on your phone, you might go to jail. So yeah, I'm going with those two countries for very different reasons.
No, that's good. And the Egypt case is maybe exemplifies the narrative arc of the book, which is all these people with great expectations, and it all ends up going badly, ends up worse than it started in a lot of the cases anyway. And maybe we can we will come on to why that happened. I mean, Phil, actually, I'm going to put you in the role of the man on the street. What's your favorite protest of the 2010s? What was there any of these kind of that marked you? I mean, just kind of going off of what, following these things, I think as we all did, virtually, where it kicks off in Egypt or it kicks off in Brazil or it kicks off in Turkey,
That marked me. I don't know about marking me, but because I wasn't directly connected to any of them in terms of these countries. I suppose I've got one abiding kind of insight gained from somebody who is more closely connected to the Arab Spring than I was. I suppose the one that I thought was most important and significant was indeed the Tunisian one. At least from afar, it seemed that way. For many of the reasons that Vincent's already said, that it seemed to be the one where the likelihood of enduring democratic gains and gains for civil liberty and so on were the likeliest, and partly because Tunisian civil society was more sophisticated and relatively autonomous for all sorts of historical and present reasons, compared to places where the state was much more likely to suffocate anything that happened, like in Egypt. So I thought, in terms of the potential, I guess, for the most advanced to be made, that did seem to me to be the story of Tunisia, though obviously more recently, even those gains seem to have been snuffed out. The other thing which stayed with me, and I suppose it stayed with me because it underscored, I suppose, my own political naivety about the Arab Spring, was a Syrian American friend who said at the time that if the Syrian opposition was unable to, and the Syrian, I suppose, uprising became an abortive, was an abortive revolution that turned into a jihad. And she said at the time that if the Syrian opposition wasn't able to overthrow the government in a peaceful way, then they should never have allowed themselves to be maneuvered into the position of civil war, because that would end up just ruining the country. And at the time, that seemed to me impossible, because it was the government that was massacring the protesters. So it seemed to me, and hundreds of people were being killed by the Ba'athist regime in Syria. And so it seemed to me to demand a kind of you know a kind of superhuman level of restraint on the part of any opposition in Syria for them to be able to withdraw from the field in the face of such overwhelming brutality and provocation from the government. In retrospect, of course, I think she was right, given the way things turned out in Syria, that there was simply no democratic, secular, national opposition that was strong enough to confront the government and to control the movement as a whole, without it fragmenting into religious and ethnic sectarianism and ultimately into an Islamist jihad against the Ba'athist state.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess not all of them degenerate into civil war, of course. But I think there's a general sort of template that emerges reading through all these cases, Vincent. You basically have, some small protest about something, police repression, the images go
Yep.
viral. It's
Right.
communicated all via social media, not just the images, but people calling each other onto the streets. And then it
Right.
kind of maybe gets out of control or doesn't end up in the way that people wanted it to. Indeed, the way that they wanted to is like a question, because you don't really know who to ask
Right.
about what the way they,
Right.
what the intention was behind it exactly. That's, I guess, if you, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me the general template. Do you
Yep.
think that there's a case, just to kind of be concrete and talk about a specific example, that is most representative of what happened across the protest decade?
Yeah, representative is tough. I mean, so I think what you've just outlined is right. The viral image of state repression is like in the majority of the cases, but it's viral on social media and traditional media. So often, like, there's these things really working hand in hand. It's like Al Jazeera and Facebook, rather than just Facebook. And then, yeah, I think there's like three movements, right? There's like the initial thing that not that many people really care about. So in Brazil, it's the 20-cent bus fare rise that, like, Haddad had planned and promised to raise before he took over, before he won the election. In Ukraine, it's the association agreement with the European Union, which actually isn't very good. And there's a minority of Ukrainians that actually want to sign it. In Turkey, there's Gezi Park, which is like, the secular middle class in Istanbul would love to keep that park, but like it's not a huge deal. And then you get the second movement after the crackdown, in which, like, there's a huge sort of indescribable, often illegible sort of ball of energy in the streets with, often it was said, like with a floating signifier, like everybody brought in their own demands. And often people didn't know what to do with that. And then inevitably, people come into the streets for all of their very various reasons with their own ideas of how things should go or what this is all about, inevitably a concrete solution is imposed upon the streets. Like something real happens, and once again, the thing gets very specific. Once again, it goes back to being a very, very one of a very specific outcome out of an infinite possibilities. And so, like, I guess if Brazil were not at least an exemplary case of what I'm trying to talk about, then I would have messed up in writing this book, because I really build the book around the Brazilian case. And I think, there's a couple of things that I think make it important. A couple of elements that appear there that appear other places, although there's some things that do not appear. And of course, like I said at the beginning, I think Brazil is a more normal country than most others. Like, I don't think, your listeners will know the Brazilianization thesis. I think this is this is relevant. I think there's a lot more countries like Brazil in the world than like the US, or indeed, certainly like Hong Kong, right? Like this is a very strange situation. In 2013, like all three cases sort of follow the template of, you have imperfect democracies in middle income countries, like you have a democracy of some kind. The person was elected that's in power in Turkey and Brazil and in Ukraine. But then you get the thing being read as if it is the Arab Spring. You get the thing being interpreted by media as if they're doing Arab Spring Brazil style or doing Arab Spring Ukraine style, and this matters to the outcome. So that's one of the two reasons that I think Brazil is exemplary, is that this like strange slippage of tactics, or at least interpretations from one country to another country, ends up mattering. Like I've talked about this a lot with like other journalists that were tasked with covering this in the time in Brazil, Brazilian and foreign. And we often came to the conclusion that we would not have interpreted June 2013 the way we did if we had not been like immediately slotting it into what we had already perceived to be the Arab Spring. And then two, I think that another thing that is exemplary about the Brazil case, or at least that like reflects across many, many other of these episodes in the decade, is in moment two, in that second act, when there's a huge ball of energy in the streets, like no one knows what to do with it. Like when the crackdown comes on the Movimento Passo Livre, and then goes viral and then causes the media to say that the protests are good, and then huge amounts of people come into the streets, no one knows what to do with this ball of energy. No one knows what to do with this street movement. The MPL doesn't know what to do with it. Haddad, the mayor of Sao Paulo, doesn't know what to do with it. Dilma Rousseff doesn't know what to do with it. Most people on the streets don't know what to do with it. The media, we're running around trying to figure out how to explain it. There are a certain set of actors that find ways to take advantage of it, and that I think defines part of Brazilian history afterwards. But I think that's another thing that really reverberates across the decade. We accidentally caused a huge mass uprising. What happens now with this mass of people? I think this dictates what happens in Ukraine. I think it dictates what happens in Egypt. I think so. Those are two of the reasons that I thought it was okay to put Brazil at the center of this story. In addition to the fact that it's just the case that I know the best and that I lived through.
Yeah, I mean, you had you make reference to a very small part you played insofar as you had a tweet that kind of went viral and ended up connecting up Turkey and Brazil, June 2013, and Turkey's Gezi Park uprising. Maybe tell us about that, because I think that captures a little bit of how mimetic these things are, and the way you've already made reference to the fact that these things that happened in 2013, for example, are conscious of themselves being like Tahrir Square in Cairo, or being like the Arab Spring.
Yeah. So the first time, I'm on Twitter just starting in 2012. Ironically, it's two American reporters that are in Sao Paulo in 2012 to give a talk about the importance of social media and democratization. They are two guys that have really everybody else in liberal media at the time were saying that social media was going to make the world more progressive or more free or whatever you wanted it to be. It was going to happen according to your own view of progress. And on June 13th, 2013, which is the day of the crackdown that Brazil's mainstream media asked for, a lot of other journalists get hit harder with police repression. Two friends of mine, Piero Locatelli and Giuliano Valloni, really go viral and end up giving, Piero, cringes endlessly to this day about this, but generating a cute little name for the protest uprising, the V for Vinegar protest, because it was named, that is a play on V for Vendetta, the movie, and a reference to the fact that he was arrested for holding vinegar. So I didn't get the repression that was as bad or as Giuliano's or as famous as Piero's, but I get tear gassed. And when I get tear gassed, the crowd around me erupts into a chant saying love is over, Turkey is here, or amor acabou, a Turquia está aquí, or aqui é Turquia, I forget exactly what they were saying. And I posted on Twitter, and it goes viral around the world, but especially in Turkey. And in Gezi Park, a bunch of protesters over the next few weeks make signs and send them to me, saying we're in solidarity with Sao Paulo. The whole world is Sao Paulo. And this is reminiscent of something that was happening back in 2011. People were saying the whole world is Tahrir. And saying that everywhere is Sao Paulo and that Gezi Park and Tahrir Square are in, are in communication or sort of asking for the same thing makes more sense than when a lot of Western European or North American activists in 2011 thought they were going to do Tahrir Square in their countries. That was an even stranger iteration. And that was really, really explicit. A lot of the student protesters here in the UK thought they were doing Tahrir. Occupy Wall Street was an explicit attempt to do Tahrir. And if you look at really what Tahrir was, because they ended up generating far more energy in the streets than they were expecting. They didn't expect to take the square. They didn't expect
the Egyptians, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, the Egyptians did not expect to be in a position to take over the center of Cairo, and they end up taking the square. And ultimately, what Tahrir ends up being is a lot of people standing in the center of the capital asking for a military coup. And in the Egyptian context, getting a military coup could be progressive with reference to the Mubarak regime, especially if the military coup leads to real elections, which they actually did. But doing that elsewhere was really strange. So this was the thing that made me think about the weird things that make a post go viral. And I think it has a lot to do with like, again, slotting into things that people already know about or think that they understand very quickly. Like the fact that Brazilians were saying this is like those Muslim countries made it like really shocking and interesting to like not only users of Twitter, but like my editors that were looking for like a sexy story, the kind of stories that might like keep me from getting fired from being a journalist like everybody else in my profession. And this like, you could really write this decade as the decade in which everybody tries to do tahrir and then follow how that works or doesn't work in various circumstances. But I think, yeah,
Right.
that like strange copying and pasting of tactics is really central to
I mean,
how the
it's
decade
kind of
starts.
it's a real kind of Thomas Friedman moment in a kind of world is flat kind of way.
Yeah,
Like people genuinely believe that no, São Paulo is just like Istanbul, and for all that there might be some similarities you can draw, it's the context, the histories, the actors, the government that they're opposing,
right.
ostensibly is different. So it's a bit tricky, and so I wonder if that says something about the social composition of the protest. I mean, there's a lot of talk, I think back in the early 2010s of the graduate without a future. That was
Right.
almost like a kind of a meme at the time. And I
Right.
wonder, looking across all of these, does that kind of capture who the people are, or does it really vary place to place? Because on the one, I'm a little bit skeptical of it simply just being kind of middle class student types, but at the same time, I also don't think it's like the people or the working class en masse manifesting themselves in these sorts of protests, especially insofar as you're trying to talk about the really connected people who might be saying, Gezi is Sao Paulo.
Right. So yeah, I think that there's a distinction there which is interesting, which is that the people in the first half of the 2010s, especially in the very, very beginning of the 2010s, that are online and savvy in using the internet, that is, I think, a particular class. And in any given country, you can sort of look at relatively educated, relatively privileged, urban young people in Egypt or Turkey or Brazil. Those are the people that get online first. And I think like in Brazil, there's like, I think it ends up being interesting that like Brazilian online culture ends up being shaped by like middle class or upper little middle class, like young people in the cities that like sort of lean right. I think that like you can kind of in a strange way explain the 2010s if you want to. This is oversimplification, but through like who gets onto social media first. Like there's a book that I just read. I think it's Post Journalism by Andre Mir, and he has like, again, it's really really schematic and like oversimplified, but basically it says like in the first half of the 2010s, millennials and progressives learned how to use social media, and then second half boomers learned how to use social media, and like that explains like that's why January 6th happens, in 2021 or 2022, in the
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah.
That's like older and more conservative generation, like trying to do their social media powered revolutions. But then if you look empirically, concretely at the actual people in the square, like after that original, that first act, in the second act, you get quite a lot of people. But in general, they're not like the working class. They're usually not the organized working class. They tend to be slightly more materially privileged than average. This is often, and that's because like this is something that people discovered too. Like for deep sort of, I think, ideological reasons, the mass protest was privileged. Especially the idea of like a mass revolt would be privileged. But then if you think about like who can get to the center of the capital very quickly, it's going to be people that are slightly more privileged than people that live in the peripheries of a city or like are working as domestic laborers, right? So in Tunisia and Egypt, for example, like that second wave is quite a lot of unemployed, regular people with economic demands. Whereas that first wave that was online, that was like, or not even online, like interacting in a very savvy way with traditional media, because like everything really starts kind of because Mohamed Bouazizi's cousin knows how to take photographs and videos of the thing, of the wake of the self-immolation of his cousin, and spread it to traditional and social media. So like, I think it's correct to say that they are very often middle class protests, but that like, again, it's like really important to pay attention to the three waves, those three, that like the ways that things really do change from morning to night, from day to day. across all these cases.
Is the gap between those waves, is that crucial to kind of understanding the dynamics in these different places?
I think it's crucial to understanding the dynamics, and I think it's also crucial to understanding the like very fatal errors that were made by journalists and even policymakers. Like, for example, looking at Ukraine and coming up with a narrative to say it's all the pro-European liberals, which like they were the first 100 people out on the streets, but that second wave was not concerned with that exactly. They often were concerned with, and again, this is oversimplifying as we must on like a podcast, like, you know, looking at a history of a decade, concerned with economic improvements, concerned with, you know, de-oligarchization of the Ukrainian economy, and then police brutality, because that's often the actual spark. But then it's very easy in the West to be like, oh, they just want to join the West, they love us, and of course that flatters the biases of the journalists and the audience in the West, but then misses the middle bit, which is where there's a huge influx of people, what you would call quote unquote normal people, regular people. But I think it becomes clear also in what I call the mass protest decade that there's no such thing as normal people. There's just like a specific configuration of concrete human beings. Or you can do the Russia thing, and you can point to the fact that there really is a third moment after that huge mass of energy is unleashed on the streets of the capital of Ukraine, where the armed far right establish hegemony over self-defense forces and really push for the end of a democratically elected government. And you can do the Russia thing and just pretend that that's the whole thing. You can just be like, and you can find the images of those guys and you can say, well, that's all it is. That's the whole thing that it is.
Yeah.
And
presumably Ukraine is the only place that happened of the places you've studied where you've had like a genuine kind of armed right aspect of these uprisings.
Well, the right comes out in Brazil and Turkey in 2013. Like the Grey Wolves show up in Gezi Park, but they don't win the battle for the signification of the square. And I think it's like largely because the ultras in central Istanbul tend to be left leaning, like the Beşiktaş and the Fenerbahçe ultras that come out end up coming out with like left wing banners rather than being like in a position to push the square far to the right. And also it just kind of fizzles. You get violence, you get right-wing violence at the end of 2019 in Hong Kong, which again, there's a very easy mistake you can make if you want to say that is the same thing as what is happening in the middle of 2019, but they're not like organized militias. No, it's just people that take out sort of this energy on mainstream or mainland Chinese people. But then there's the other cases that become wars very quickly. So that's another case. I mean, I guess Sunni militias in Syria are like, you could call them the armed right. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an
Yeah.
interesting comparison. Yeah.
I mean, in all of the cases, I think, or most of them, there is to a certain degree a co-optation or a channeling of the energy to a certain group or certain people who are either more organized, as you point out the case of the armed far right in Ukraine, but also just of more powerful agents. So whether it's the media, the kind of oligarchic media, or sitting politicians who are able to channel things to their benefit. And I think what comes through, and one of the highlights of the book for me is in the penultimate chapter where you're trying to kind of pull together all these pieces and you bring together some of your star interviewees, as it were, from these different places and ask them to reflect on, what would you do differently or what do you regret? And a lot of them voice a quite fundamental point and an important theme throughout the book, which is we shouldn't have rejected representation. That politics abhors a vacuum, which is a bit of a cliche, but is very true and comes and is a point that gets hammered home, tacitly throughout the book.
What's wrong with cliches? This is one of the things that I don't like about like the 21st century media environment. Like you have to come up with like new analyses all the time. Sometimes it's just stuff is just right and it stays right. Like when you talk about like the military industrial complex in the US, it sounds like you're talking about like groovy like 1970s like concepts, but it's just like it still is the military industrial complex. Like that's just some things just remain true and cliches stick around for a reason. And I think in the beginning of the 2010s we thought that we could throw out a lot of the lessons of like 3,000 years of political struggle because of like the internet. Turns out that's not right. Unfortunately, it'd be great if it was true. It's just not right.
So obviously, the flip side to representation and leadership is things like, and you kind of identify these in that same chapter: apparent spontaneity, leaderlessness, horizontalism, digital coordination, public mass protest, and you could probably throw in as well prefiguration.
Right.
So maybe for people who maybe aren't familiar with some of these cases, or to kind of just to illustrate it, is there a case that you could bring up to talk through how a lot of these protests saw themselves, or how some of the initiators of the protest, to not call them leaders, some of the initiators of these protests saw themselves, and how they saw what they were trying to do?
Yeah, and so that like particular package, that recipe of tactical elements or tactical and organizational elements, I try to explain like where each one comes from, and I try to explain that none of them are natural. I try to explain that they don't have to go together, but they really feel like they're supposed to, for a lot of people in the 2010s. But this varies, right? So in the case of Brazil, I think, as you know, the Movimento Passe Livre really believed in direct action.
Tell us who they are, because listeners
Yeah,
probably
right.
won't be familiar.
Yeah. I assume you, because you know, like you've been talking about this nonstop for the last 10 years, but outside of Brazil, it's, I mean,
It's
even actually Brazilians, I found that
yeah.
Brazilians forgotten who they are because the MBL has really stolen their thunder. The
Well, you should tell us about how that happened too, because that's
right.
good.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, the Movimento Passe Livre, the Free Fair movement, is born in 2005, but they're really kind of the class of 1999. A lot of them used to work at Indie Media Brazil. They were linked ideologically and organizationally to the anti or alter globalization movement. A lot of them went to the same university. A lot of them were from the anarcho punk scene. They had all known each other for quite a long time, and they organized around the full decommodification of public transportation. So, in the final instance, they wanted the state to make bus rides and metro transportation free for everyone. And what they always did every year from 2005 to 2013, whenever there was an increase in the price of transportation, they would organize protests. And they were, some would now say, dogmatically horizontalist. So this group not only had no leaders, they had no division of labor. So this small group of people would rotate all of the tasks that the group would carry out. And to make any decision, they had to reach full consensus. And this was something that became, was a big part of sort of Occupy Wall Street, and a lot of other movements had this idea of horizontalism, meaning really like so anti-authoritarian that the idea of like taking a vote and all doing something as a result, that's authoritarianism, because like every single person needs to agree to the plan, or else that's an imposition of collective will somehow.
The Polish parliament.
The Polish parliament?
Yeah, it was like, some of the acts, I knew people involved on the edges of, or maybe not even on the edges. I did some of the people involved in Occupy Wall Street, and they said, they were kind of grad students, political theorists, and they used the example of the Polish parliament because the famous, before Poland's partition, part of the reason it was partitioned is because they had this oligarchic parliament of nobles, and each noble had a veto. And so it was impossible to organize themselves in time to be able to stave off the partition of Poland. And so they were the ones who used this example of the Polish parliament in Occupy, because the insistence on every participant having a veto made it impossible to get anything done.
Yeah, it's a great way to, if you want, looking back, I'm being sort of unkind because a lot of people really believed in this, but it would be a great way to make a country ungovernable, wouldn't it, if you were to write that into the Constitution? But it worked for them for 8 years because they knew each other well enough. They really shared ideological and tactical approaches. And they also really believed in direct action and prefigurative direct action. So there was a set of spontaneous, or if you want to get really theoretical, which maybe you guys do, I don't know. I kind of think spontaneity is not actually real. I think there's no such thing as spontaneity. If you really want to be honest about it, I'm basically stealing that from Rodrigo Nunes, but I agree with him anyways. So I now think it. But they really believe in the triggering a mass revolt as a way to get things done. And this is because basically they've seen this happen in other parts of Brazil, going back to Bahia and Florianópolis earlier in the 2000s. So they shut down, they block turnstiles, they make it impossible for people to pay, or they block the public, large roads, forcing essentially some sort of chaos in the city. inevitably entering into conflict with police and hopefully spurring more people to come to the streets. They always knew that they needed to lose control. This is something they told me. They always knew that they wanted to somehow lose control over the streets. They always knew that it needed to get out of hand. They needed to inspire more people to come behind them. But then they said, in retrospect, we lost control to a much greater extent than we ever expected, and we didn't like it. They found out that people coming out to the streets after them chronologically is not quite the same as coming to the streets behind them. So in June 2013, after that protest that I described that I was repressed at, so many people come into the streets that they don't really know what to do with the new arrivals. And the new arrivals come because of the way that they've understood the protests as presented to them by the media. So on like the first day of the big influx, I'm out on the streets and I see a group of what we would now recognize as like proto-Bolsonaristas, guys in like beefy white guys in football tops, yellow and green football jerseys, like getting into arguments with the original punks and leftists. A week later, they actually throw many of the original left-wing parties off the streets. They physically expel them.
So just to clarify, so when these guys come on, the Bolsonaristas, like, are they're there because they're just looking for a fight, or are they there because they're also angry about the price rises and what have you?
They're angry about their own things. And so this is a really strange, like, so this
it's
is
a
why
free-for-all anger box that you can just shout into.
So the media basically extends an open invitation to the entire country. Is there anything you don't like? Come to the streets and say that, right? And like this happens because I think deep in our sort of dumb journalist brains, on the morning of June 13th, 2013, the mass media in Brazil is saying this is a really bad thing. These punks and anarchists need to be cleared off the streets. But then our own, especially like journalists, like white, photogenic, middle class reporters at Brazil's most mainstream outlets get hit. And there's like an outpouring of sympathy, not only among the media, but in the population for whatever this protest is. But like for the media to switch their narrative from this is a bad thing to this is a glorious patriotic uprising in defense of, and then they have to look deep in their like ideological toolbox to find something they can put into that sentence to make it possible to say that it's good to go to the streets. So these guys that show up,
it's worth. Sorry, but it's possibly the funniest thing I've ever witnessed live. Because I mean, I was living in London, not in São Paulo at the time, but following this on like social media and whatever, and I think global. I don't remember if I was able to watch it online, but anyway, and they're kind of quite sensationalist journalist who covers like crime and whatever, does a poll where he asks like, do you support this rioting? And then instead of expecting, the usual kind of audience to be like, no, this is terrible, 90%, no, it was like 70%, yes, we support it. And he's like, I think you haven't understood the question. Well, we're going to restart the poll. He does it again and it's like same result. And then he's suddenly stumped. And then he goes like, yeah, maybe actually. Anyway, that's like a real perfect pivot moment where the mainstream media goes, okay, wait, so if we can't stand against this, we're going to need to just, to put it cynically, we're going to need to kind of take control of this or channel it to our advantage somehow.
Yeah, and you could like watch, the clip is on YouTube. It's Datena. You could watch Datena, like his eyes sort of like roll back in his skull and he's like frantically looking for some reason in his kind of like reactionary, like law and order brain. Like what can make it okay to do rioting? And he's like looking and he's like grabbing for something. And so I don't think that major media in Brazil, like Globo or whatever, try to redirect it. I think they're just like the only things that we can think of to say that could be a reason that a protest like this is good end up being sort of necessarily the center-right kind of stuff that Globo believes in, right? And so to answer your question, Philip, so on January 17th, which is the next big protest after I get tear-gassed, after we all get attacked, it's very strange. Like there's all kinds of people there. And like at the front, there's still kind of the same group of identifiably university educated leftists, but there's just like a lot of normal looking people. And some of them, not all of them, are bringing patriotic symbols. Some of them, not all of them, are like probably sort of like common sense right wing or anti-politics guys. I think even they're more anti-political than they are even consciously right wing at this point. And they come just with their own ideas. And a lot of times they're waving a sign that says corruption. They're saying, Lula's a crook. And the new punks, and this is, again, it's really funny, but it's so like tragic looking back on it. The new punks see it as their job to like call in rather than call out the new arrivals. They're like, oh, no, guys, like waving nationalist symbols is quite dangerous in a protest like this. That can lead to fascism. We want to stay focused on bus fares. We want to stay focused on improving the welfare state. And these new guys, I think not yet right wing, but like I'm sure that these guys became Bolsonaristas. Were like, fuck you. I don't want to listen to you. Like, I reject you acting as if you know something about this protest that I don't. I'm here for my own reasons. And then when I got back to my house later that night, lo and behold, even though that was kind of a minority of people on the streets, like white people or like beautiful young white, like Brazilian women with like green and yellow like face paint, even though that was a small minority of what I saw in the streets, that's what Global put on TV. That's what like the rest of the country and the rest of the world saw as what was happening on the streets. And so the next day, there was quite a higher proportion of people like that. I think because the country saw the reporting, believed that's what it was all about, and then went to the thing that they thought existed. And this is something that the original MPL that didn't know, they were like, what is going on? These people aren't showing up to the protests that we put on. They're showing up to a protest that didn't exist until the media said it did. And I think this, into various, Brazil becomes the most strange and like paradoxical for me, but something like this happens across the decade. And so because of horizontalism, because of the way that they don't believe in leading anything, and because of the way that they don't believe in leading anything and the way that they have to reach full consensus, they can't do two things. One, they can't decide on how to change tactics in the face of very, very different circumstances. So they have like 14, 16-hour meetings trying to come up with a new plan. They can't figure out what to do. Two, waves of Brazilians want to join their group. Brazilians show up saying, we want to join the MPL. We've seen that you've organized these cool protests. You're heroically fighting the police. We want to join the group. But their horizontalism does not allow them to integrate huge numbers of people at once, because there's two ways they can do it. One, they can set up a like two-tiered structure where the original organizers do the 14-hour meetings, but everyone else is kind of allowed to like do smaller tasks. But that's called the Leninist deviation. That is discarded immediately. That's like that would be hierarchy. That would be introducing everything they tried to avoid for 8 years. But they also can't let them all join, because if you let like 100 people join or 1,000 people join a movement that is built around 40 people that agree about everything, now the movement is just whatever everyone says it is, because everyone has an equal voice. Everyone can block everything. It's the Polish parliament. But then, so to answer here, this is a long answer to a simple question. But like in Egypt, for example, the movement, I would say, the vast majority of people in the square were not horizontalist. They were just involved in a horizontally structured protest. They would have loved to have the kind of things that Tunisia had a little bit more concretely, as you said. They would have loved to have a large autonomous labor union that could get behind a revolutionary, that could take a revolutionary position. They would have loved to have a revolutionary party. They would have loved to have civic society organizations. They just didn't. And then what you have is the media showing up, and there's an elective affinity, I think, between the elements in the square, which are both ideological and horizontal, and like, again, the deep ideological assumptions in the brains of people like Anderson Cooper or like whoever shows up in the New York Times, because they want to see the thing that will tell them that it's kind of like the new Berlin Wall protest. Like it's going to be a liberal post-ideological thing. So they do find the elements in the square, but it's not really that they even believe it. It's just that the concrete decimation of civil society in Egypt under sort of brutal neoliberalism, but also the Mubarak authoritarian regime just means that they are horizontal rather than horizontalist.
So, but on this, so I'm curious, like how, given that you see the horizontalism recurring and the differences, the concrete differences between all these different places, like you talked about, between Egypt and Brazil, for instance, how do you explain the recurrence of horizontalism as a global phenomenon in circumstances that are so disparate and so different in national, kind of geographic, political, ideological, all these different contexts?
Well, so it exists. Horizontalism as an approach, an explicit approach, exists to different degrees. And it exists to different degrees, I think, because of both material and ideological reasons. So on the one hand, this becomes the kind of thing that is easiest to do and the most possible to put together in an era of global neoliberalism after the decimation of mass parties, after the decimation of left-wing structures, after the decimation of trade union movements around the world. So in many, many cases, and horizontalism is born out of a moment in 2001 in Argentina where there's an absolute collapse of representative structures. So to various degrees around the world, you have this particular form being made easier, or being made perhaps the most possible or the only possible form that a movement can take quickly. And in other cases, you have the actual ideological elements, which trace back to the alter globalization movement, some parts of what becomes the generally accepted idea of what the New Left was, rather than perhaps what it always was. And then again, you have this third element where there is this elective affinity between the media that shows up and what in the square that can be called horizontalist. So hopefully what I do in each case is outline to the extent that there is this kind of an approach. Hong Kong, by the end, they go for all out absolute hyper individualism. Everyone's allowed to do whatever they want. No one can question that. Gezi Park is quite takes in an assemblyist, prefigurative approach for quite a while. But again, not everyone likes that. A lot of people on the Turkish left are don't do that. We need to elaborate a set of demands. We have this brief moment that we can present to Erdogan a list of things that we want, and he probably will give them to us. In Egypt, basically, I think it was just a small group of Western-facing liberals that actually kind of believed in this stuff. But horizontality, I think, is global because of global neoliberalism and ideological diffusion of basically Californian and North American anarchist / libertarian approaches to politics that everyone at least knows about, if not having been actually really, really influenced by, they at least have trickled down in some form or another to most of the planet in the 2010s.
Just one more point on this. So I'm curious to hear just a bit more about those places where there was some kind of organized or some kind of civil society infrastructure and some political organization. So you mentioned a Hojist party in Tunisia. The Turkish left, has kind of strong autonomous organized roots and so on.
Yep.
So just to talk a bit about the interaction between these upsurges and existing institutions, were they unable to direct them? Did they defer to them? Did they retreat from them? How did these established left groups interact in the context you've looked at?
Yeah, so I think, as Alex indicated earlier, often what is generated accidentally is a power vacuum, or at least a situation in which elites are willing to give up something, but also a situation in which the square cannot really speak for itself. So some degree of co-optation, I think, happens always. I think some degree of someone stepping into the vacuum and saying, we are what this is, or even seizing the square and sort of, moving in a direction and claiming, or whether entirely truthfully or partially truthfully or not truthfully at all, that we are building upon what the square wanted. So as a rubric to understand what happens, you can see who ends up actually able to make the square speak. South Korea is an example where it's quite easy to speak with one voice, and unions play a role in helping that to happen. But they're asking for something quite easy, which is the impeachment of a corrupt president. In Tunisia, I think that the original left party, this Tunisian Workers' Party, is quite important in getting the protests off the ground, and then the UGTT is really important at throwing its weight behind the call for the removal of the leader of Tunisia, and that works. And in some cases, and then there's who enters the power vacuum in the moment of reconstruction, in the moment of transition. And in Ukraine, it's not established organized left structures, but it is these militant far right groups that end up playing not an absolute role, which is the Russian narrative, but punching above their weight in directing what happens next, in playing much larger of a role than they should have, based on their, not only because they're neo-Nazis, but also just because of how few people in Ukraine actually agree with them in structuring the transition. So it varies widely. Or in Bahrain, there is two pretty well-structured, cautious groups that just get crushed by a much larger, more organized force, which is Saudi Arabia, which drives over the bridge and puts down the whole thing, even though the secular or the cross-sectarian left party and the Shia opposition are very well structured and know what they want and are asking for things that are quite reasonable. Somebody bigger comes along and imposes meaning upon that uprising.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that occurs to me, kind of joining up some dots, and also referring to an episode we had on this podcast a little while ago about the way people are induced to think under neoliberalism or under kind of financialization, which is very short termist and speculative, right? And like
Right.
speculation becomes the way that we do things. And I made this note in the margins when I read your book, that it seems like the kind of speculative mode is the way that it's being done, because very few people have an idea of what their end goal is. I think
Right.
in a lot of these protests, they might have a demand, and sometimes it coheres around a demand. But in many cases, the protest starts snowballing and exceeding the initial demand. So, like Brazil is a good example of this, but so is Hong Kong, the way you illustrate it, where it's about ending this rendition, or not rendition,
Extradition.
extradition treaty with mainland China, and then it becomes like these 5-point things, and then it becomes an anti-China thing, and it just kind of snowballs completely out of control. And so, yeah, what strikes me about it is that it's people kind of speculating. It's not that you have to come to a protest with like a ready-made idea of like what your endpoint is and exactly how you're going to get there. But I think what I gathered, at least from the interviews you've done, is no one is ever actually sitting down and going, okay, this is the end goal, this is the strategy to get there. It's speculative the whole way along the way. It's like throw something out there, okay, cool, now we're here, let's do this next. And it's just hit and hope, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, this is something that a lot of not only interviewees, but like theorists across the world come to understand, is that these are protests that not only happen often in opposition to neoliberal economic policies, they are carried out by neoliberalized subjects. They are carried out by people who really are quite individual. They really kind of think of themselves, like the entrepreneurship of the self, I think ends up really mattering in the Brazilian context. The sort of the lack of ability to imagine actual revolutionary change, the sort of betting on the huge uprising and just sort of assuming that's going to work. I think these are all like some of the subjective conditions of the uprising. And yeah, as you say, like this is something that a lot of interviewees said, like, oh, we really, really didn't plan for what was supposed to happen after we got people on the streets. We just assumed that was going to go well. And then even if like, and there are several cases I think of this where you really could have got something. I mean, like Hong Kong, it was initially about the extradition bill, but like it wasn't really. It quickly became just about, I think, the larger question of autonomy from Beijing. But like the Hong Kong government does say, I mean, they say it in a very ham-fisted way, and this is, I think even Beijing, in addition to like a lot of Hong Kongers would fault Carrie Lam for the way that she does this. She does say, okay, fine, no more extradition bill. But then when you have the opportunity to get more, you have sort of, everybody throwing stuff at the wall. And like, this is tragic, and I wish this wasn't the case, but you kind of get like the demands with the most upvotes or like the most retweets that become the ones that are presented to the state. And very crucially, there's no exit strategy. It's not like a union organization where if you say, if we get a 30% wage, we will go back to work tomorrow. It's just like a lot of stuff. And if you're the state, even if you're predisposed to give the streets what they quote unquote want, even if that were possible to understand, there's no promise that they're going to just not turn around and ask for 1,000 more things. So you ultimately, like in the Hong Kong case, Beijing just decides to wait them out. They're like, a lot of the stuff we could do, we don't really, the last thing we want is to allow the United States to, shine a huge spotlight on repression in Hong Kong. But like, what's the exit strategy? And when you have the Polish parliament, when you have everybody in the square having their own right to say what the thing is about, if somebody elaborates 3 demands, which are pretty radical but also doable, and then the state gives in to them, the state has no reason to believe that half of the square isn't going to say, nope, I veto that. We want more. That's not what we were asking for. And this becomes sort of like a fundamental and painful dilemma that appears that no one had really expected, because no one had really expected to put that many people on the streets.
Yeah. I mean, what's amazing, this is just a footnote in the book towards the end, but it's an amazing punchline, if only it were a laughing matter,
Right.
where you note, similarly, Barack Obama had said that the biggest mistake of his presidency was failing to plan for the day after in Libya. So, it's not just students in the street protesting who aren't thinking about the day after. It's also the most powerful person in the world, and around that period as well. So yeah, it does seem to speak to something about our age, about a lack of ability to kind of plan. Except, you know, if you're Barack Obama, you can get away with it and nothing happens to you. But if you're a Hong Kong protester, you're banged up by the PRC and the PRC. So, you know, kind of different consequences, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that actually really matters a lot, because I think the next line in that footnote is like, I don't know if I believe him, because at the very least, the United States, I'm sure Barack Obama, deep in his heart, would have loved to see the flowering of like a pro-Western democracy in Libya or whatever. But if you look at the way that the U.S. actually acts in response to the so-called Arab Spring, but you know, in many, many countries around the world in the last 20 years, it seems like they're quite fine with putting up with failed states. Like that might be like not what they're asking for, not what they hope to happen, but if that's what they get, that's okay. Whereas like Barack Obama, like unlike George Bush, I think should know better, because George Bush was like dumb enough to really think that like Iraq was going to turn into Arizona. I think he like really thought that like you were going to get like, you know, like the suburbs of Canada or whatever, just like flowering in Baghdad. But yeah, I think that it just kind of, it didn't matter to Obama, whereas it really mattered to Egyptians or to Syrians, as you say, Philip.
Yeah.
Like what actually happens when you pick a fight you can't win, or you start a process to try to improve your country and you realize, oh, actually we can't. What we can just do is this other thing, which is very scary.
So one thing that, I mean, we talked about this at a bar in about a year ago, Vincent, about the role of how protest changed, or that protest doesn't really seem to have a sense of its own objective. And what ends up becoming kind of the protagonist in this story is the media. So I kind of want to ask you, is the media the protagonist in this story? And I don't just mean the mainstream media, but media kind of in general. Because everything is so diffuse, uncoordinated, fragmentary, individualized, etc., it seems like media ends up being the kind of star of the show.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in this book more than I would like to be, because the media is more important, I think, for this decade than I would like it to be. And like what I mean by that is like deep in my heart, like I would like history to be powered by like material concerns. I don't like to look to like you know, phenomenological phenomenon as like the driver of history. Like it doesn't, I don't like deep down aesthetically, morally, I don't like the idea that we're kind of like getting distracted by something that we see and then like running after it. But I think in some parts of this story that you can only really understand what happens if you place mediation at the center of the story. And I think, yeah, you said at the bar, like you don't want to overstate the, what was it, the hypermediation thesis? Was that what you called
Well,
it?
yeah, but I end up even kind of coming back to it, and certainly these days I kind of think, well, kind of maybe all those theorists who said like media was going to be everything, maybe they were kind of right.
I wish they weren't. Like that's the thing. Well, I mean, I guess it may be the case that the book is about tactics, right? So if the book was about like deep structural changes, it would be strange for media to power the whole story. But if we're talking about the transfer of tactics and the adoption of particular repertoires of contention, then I think media has to be at the center of the story. Because if you're looking at only like the sort of deep sociological structural factors, you can't explain why Brazil has an uprising of that type in June 20. You can't explain the apparent similarity of so many things across a decade in which political systems and economic conditions are so different. Like it really is strange for there to be a quote unquote Brazilian spring. So for this book, I go back to the history of protest itself, as one particular way of responding to injustice, of one particular way of reacting to elites who abuse human beings. And it's important that like there are many ways to do that. But I mean, if you look at the history of protest, it always does exist in dialogue with media in some way or another. I think that I come to the conclusion that protests are fundamentally media actions, are fundamentally communicative actions. You don't get protest until you get mass media, whether that is initially newspapers or in the middle of the 20th century, you see an acceleration or a multiplication effect on mass protest as a result of television and radio. And then I think with social media, you get another acceleration or multiplication effect on protests. So like you can go into the streets tomorrow and generate a spectacle that the whole world can see within 1 hour, whereas boycotts or strikes, which might be more effective at actually putting pressure on elites that care quite a lot about economic performance, they do not generate the sort of heat or get your blood going the way that a viral post with a really inspiring photograph might. And I think there's nothing wrong with protests being fundamentally communicative. There's nothing wrong with understanding that getting a bunch of people on the streets to deliver a message to elites is what we're doing, as long as that is what is understood. But often what happens in this, I think two things happen in this decade that have a lot to do with the role of the media. One is this particular type of protest, the horizontally structured, apparently spontaneous protest, really relies a lot upon media, either social or traditional, to impose meaning upon it, to speak for it. And so if media is on your side, that can be all right, but they're still going to be looking at the protest and picking and choosing things that they would like to see in the square. And this is different from, for example, like the protests that would have been put together by Black civil rights organizations in the 50s and 60s. Like, even though they absolutely were kind of media stunts, like everything is a media stunt in I think the world of hypermediation, you still know who was in charge or who was going to be explaining what was asked for. But then if the media does not like what you're doing, and I think this is something that I've experienced recently with these pro-Palestine protests, is that the media can just say whatever they want about what is happening on the streets. So these, because they are fundamentally communicative actions, you must understand that it is going to be mediated, of course, through the media in ways which are going to matter. And this is, a lot of interviewees came to the conclusion this was a weakness of this particular form, that it gave too much power to people like me or people at CNN or like the guy on Twitter or the girl on Twitter that gets the viral post, which defines the thing. And then secondly, this is, I think, one of the other tragic sort of slippages or unexpected conundrums in the decade, is that these mass protests become so massive, they get so big that they actually generate revolutionary situations. But a fundamentally communicative action cannot form a revolutionary government. It might be able to elaborate demands if it is well structured, but like a protest, a demonstration, is not going to actually be able to seize power and push the country in a new direction. So you had this strange situation in certain moments in the decade where people continued to like send messages to elites that were no longer there. They were like still
that's a great,
they were
yeah.
they were standing in the square demanding that the people in power fix things, but there were no more people in power. That would have been a moment that other revolutionary types of revolutionary moments in history would have taken advantage of and tried to like actually form, depending on where you are, like a dual power situation, or actually depending on how easy it is to take over a given state, or at least to like lodge yourself into a position where you have leverage. But you had this strange disconnect between media, or at least mediated actions, and revolutionary situations.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the things that illustrates that is the way that these things can seem kind of in many ways a bit trite or silly, at the same time as deadly serious. And one of the ways that happens, I think, is the use of pop culture. One of your interviewees in Hong Kong, reflecting back on the protests of 2014 and especially 2019, I think it's a little sad that we got many of our ideas from pop culture. And so like you have these kind of silly meme things, but at the same time often leading to situations which are proto-revolutionary, which at any rate change the course of the history of their countries, and lead to changes of government or different structures or whatever. And so I kind of struggle to wrap my head around it. Like, okay, so these people are doing something that they learned from the Hunger Games, but at the same time, this is also going to lead to a massive reorientation and affect not just that own country, but that country's relations with other countries, international relations, and so on. And it's kind of like, I don't know, there's a weird kind of breakdown between high and low all in one go.
Yeah, in Hong Kong especially, I think there's like these are tragic conversations that are had, because like Hong Kong, first because of the British, but then because of the strange and like very, very dysfunctional way that they were integrated into the PRC, like isn't supposed to have political culture, isn't supposed to have political organizations. Like British imperialism, like basically did not allow for like intentionally the kinds of organizations that could act as in as concrete parts of society in the way that we spoke about Tunisia. And a lot of these kids, like they were like looked at very, very wistfully, be like, yeah, like we just kind of thought it would be like the movies, and we don't know what we even thought was supposed to happen, because we ended up kind of declaring war on Beijing, but like we're a tiny city in a much, 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 much bigger country. Hong Kongers, at no point did Hong Kongers ever want independence from the PRC. I mean, if you ask them if they wanted particular types of democratization, you often get a small majority that would say yes. But at no point did they actually want the autonomy from the PRC or the full independence from the PRC that came to be some of the loudest voices are often echoed by sympathetic Western media. And they look back and they're like, yeah, we just kind of thought it would be like Hunger Games or like V for Vendetta. As everybody learned a couple of years later, it was real life, and it was Beijing in that case that stepped into they waited it out, and then they just, I think, kind of accelerated the process of integration a couple
What
years
about
later.
just a quick, I mean, I know Alex wants to come back on this. Just a quick question about Hong Kong, and then I had another question by the media. But on Hong Kong, one thing that was certainly flagged up by the British press, I don't know elsewhere, but it was the use of the old colonial Hong Kong flag.
Yep.
Obviously, as a way to flatter it was obviously a way to flatter British sentiment as to the benefits of the empire and so on. But I wonder, how significant was that? Or was that a minoritarian aspect of the protest?
So it certainly became widely represented. I mean, Fin Lau, who came up with the "If we burn, you burn with us," not even a slogan. It was a GIF that he attached to a post, and that went viral, and then became sort of a thing that people were actually holding in the streets, like an actual slogan or an actual sign that people were holding in the streets. I interviewed him 2 times here in London, and the second time I interviewed him, he showed up with like a monarchist pin on his lapel. So like he is pro British monarchy. But I think that what happened in Hong Kong is that there was indeed one moment where quite a lot of normal people were on the streets, and those people, the vast majority, if you ask them, was British imperialism a good thing, or is Donald Trump a good thing, they would have said no, I believe. But as things went on longer and longer and longer, you had more and more radical groups that were active and acting in spectacular ways. And one of those spectacles was the unfurling of the British colonial flag in the Ledgeco. Another one which got quite a lot of attention. And this was interesting because this was an element that was picked up by 2 very different types of media. When they started waving the American flag or pictures of Donald Trump, these were elements that were picked up by both like Fox News and Beijing. Both Beijing and Fox News loved to say that was what the whole thing was all about.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because, Marco Rubio was like, look, they love America. They want us to help. They are, and, absolutely some Hong Kongers, and some of them that became prominent in an increasingly right-wing and increasingly nativist. As the year went on, it became more right-wing and more nativist. Did believe that somehow that this would only work if the United States swept in and saved them, and that was never going to happen. But again, like that mistake, or perhaps intentional misrepresentation, was characteristic of Hong Kong. The one that claims that the thing that is happening in November with kids in full riot gear, or in the most extreme cases, like lighting a guy on fire or beating up a man for speaking Mandarin, are the same thing as the mass protests in June, which were just against the extradition bill. But like that absolutely happened, and it mattered to the way that it was interpreted.
Yeah. I think it reinforces your point. I mean, the political naivete that it would require to imagine that Britain was going to, go to war with China to, take back Hong Kong. Right. I mean, it's completely absurd. It's the fantasy politics. And I mean, I suppose you could attribute it to desperation, but it's also, It just seems to me, given how high the stakes genuinely were, also just at another level, kind of unforgivably stupid. It would seem to me if I had been in Hong Kong. And so again, it kind of speaks to, I think it speaks to that, like you say, that kind of deracinated, media-driven aspect of the protest. But on the flip side, the other, I wanted to just kind of quickly get your view on this because it just struck me while listening. I mean, how much of it was also just the Western media, and I'm thinking of a particular kind of Western journalist whose reference points, like you say, I don't know, maybe a millennial journalist,
Yep.
maybe a Gen Xer, whose reference points, like you say, are all basically, the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, that's the only reference. Yeah.
Yeah, and nothing really, kind of no meaningful ability to differentiate political options, ideological differences, to understand the historical roots and how they map out. Probably don't speak even, kind of that many languages. So I wonder, I mean, how important was that, just the dumbness of the people who were arriving from the New York Times or CNN or whatever? I mean, how important was that? I mean, I don't want to overstate it, and I guess I'm,
I think
obviously
it's
I'm
important.
biased, but
I mean, maybe I pay particular attention to it because I'm like, this is my class of people, so I think it's important for me to be critical. But I think it's important. I mean, I'm not going to I did. So Daniel Vukovic, who's a Hong Kong-based academic, and Ao Lung Yu, who are both, who's a Hong Kong leftist, they both come to the conclusion that the Hong Kong protest became hyper-mediated, just really all about this positive or perhaps negative feedback loop between the kind of things that would get you positive press in the West. So people would learn subconsciously or consciously what kind of things they could do that would get them coverage, and then they would just do more of that, and then that became the thing. And then a lot of the Hong Kongers that did it came to the same conclusion. Like, it became so hyper-mediated. And again, I don't like this conclusion at a deep level because I like to think that history is driven by more important stuff. But I think that they matter. I think that really, like the like lizard brain, everyone's doing liberal revolution. Every time there's crowds in the street, it's Berlin Wall. I don't need to read a history book. That's all I need to know. Bad government cracking down. I don't need to ask what's going to come afterwards. I think the dumbness of people in my class actually matters quite a lot. And I really wish it didn't. I think and in Ukraine, I think it matters a little bit. I really wish it didn't. And, I'm not going to go even specify countries, but I had interviews with some colleagues where I would say, in whatever, in X country that you were covering, what were the demands? And they would kind of be like, they didn't know. I was like, well, yeah, but what was the plan? Like, what was the most prominent, demands? Like, what would have been success for that particular movement? And they're like, well, I don't know, but the government was bad and was using police brutality. I was like, yeah, I know that. Like, this is a geopolitical enemy. They're bad. They're using police repression. That's bad. But like, what did the movement want? And they didn't know. Yeah. And then they'd be like, well, I wasn't really on the forums where these things were being hammered out because I can't read the language of that country. And I was like, okay, well, you were like really responsible for representing this thing to the world and tragicomically to reconfiguring the actual thing on the street, I think.
Right. That's a very important point. It's not just representing it outwards, right? It's representing back to itself.
Yeah.
And again, I don't love it. I wish, it seems too silly and what's that word? It seems too frivolous to to include in a work of serious global history. But perhaps we live in an era in which, the most, thousands of years of human science and technology have all been directed towards distracting and stimulating human beings in a way which is deeply moving, but also has negative consequences. And so, maybe it's somehow material too, but it's a strange thing that comes up, I think, with this particular type of illegible protest explosion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you even conclude about, is it all silly or is it all actually incredibly meaningful and these moments of popular eruption where everyone feels connected and love and all the rest of it. And it's real, but also you leave the possibility that it's kind of all fake or manipulated, and it's quite hard to tease the two apart. And I guess you have to kind of go on a case by case basis.
Right.
I'll ask you about kind of your conclusions about it in just a second. There's a couple of two other things actually I wanted to raise. One is, I mean, you've made comments about this being the kind of Western press, in many cases Western media, reinterpreting and reinterpreting the meaning of these protests, which are often kind of diffuse anyway, but then kind of channeling back to something that maybe the participants didn't intend. But there's also a sense, I think you make some reference to the fact that these are generally the countries that you talk about are in the global south.
Right.
Maybe Hong Kong doesn't really count in that regard, but it's maybe an ambiguous position.
Yeah. None of them are in the traditional first world. That's what
Yeah, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Like, are these sorts of protests more necessary in those sorts of countries? Did you choose to cover them because you thought things in Spain or Greece were less important or less urgent? What's the kind of rationale behind the selection of these of the cases that you look at? And is there a political point behind it, I guess?
Well, the criterion that I for the inclusion in this book was that protests got so big that they either fundamentally destabilized or overthrew an existing government. But again, I made up that criterion myself. I could have fudged it however I wanted to include different countries. But I think there's a couple reasons that things like Spain, Greece, and Occupy Wall Street not only don't get big enough to fundamentally dislodge existing governments, but also don't enter into this strange, contradictory, this kind of like tragic conundrum that we've been discussing. So on the one hand, if you're in the traditional global north, if you're in New York or Paris or Madrid, the global media and the most powerful governments in the world will grant your repressive apparatus in your given nation the benefit of the doubt to repress as they see fit. And they will say, oh yeah, well, whatever they're doing, they're probably like putting in jail the people that are breaking the law. And they're probably treating respectfully the people that are not breaking the law. Very rarely are you going to get the kind of re-representation which like beams out to the world. This government is no longer legitimate. They've become a tyranny. They're cracking down on their population in a way which means they're no longer the democratically elected country that we all believe them to be, which is like arguably something that shouldn't have happened in places like Brazil, Turkey, and Ukraine, because as imperfect as those democracies are, often if you have a leader who's fucking up, the best way to resolve it is to let voters pick the next one. And then in the case of like actual imperial counterattack, I think I say this in the book in like half a sentence, but it's kind of like, I mean, it's glib, but it kind of matters. Libya ends with NATO launching a regime change campaign that destroys the country. If you're in NATO, NATO is not going to bomb itself. Like you're not going to get like the type of international pressure from outside that really forces to get things over the line. And so to get over the line, to fulfill this criterion that I made up, a lot of things have to come into play. It has to be multi-causal. But I think one of them ends up being the view from outside that you've lost legitimacy. Your place in the global order will not be backed up by more powerful entities. But then part two, which is this real slippage, this real strange contradiction, this thing that like where this hypermediation becomes so problematic, is that often if you're looking at what people are really asking for in the global south, they're asking to join the first world in the sense of we want your money. They're asking to reconfigure the global system in a way which will require changing the rules, taking some power or resources away from the first world and transferring them to the global south. They're asking for something that is properly anti-systemic. But often these are read as protests, which are just like, we want to join the global order as partners with the first world. We want to become junior America, right? So properly, I think so often like third worldist goals, because to like really get people in Ukraine the economic outcomes that they're asking for in 2013, they can't just like be allowed to associate with the European Union. There has to be like real investment transfer of resources. There has to be a reconfiguration of the relationship. But often this gets read as like, oh, they just want to be our partners. They want to be on our side against the bad countries. And so a conclusion that I come to in The academic version of the talk that I've been giving about this book is that this particular form, this particular type of mass protest really works best if it's a pro-systemic uprising, if really you just kind of want to let the existing global system pour into whatever power vacuum you can create. If you want to somehow reconstruct, or if you want to somehow impose the global order, if you want to change the rules or to sort of push against it in some way, that's going to generate a counterattack, some kind of a counter-revolution. And this particular form is very, very poorly suited to withstanding a counter-revolution. So in Egypt, for example, a lot of the original organizers came together through pro-Palestine solidarity or through opposition to the war in Iraq. They saw a democratic movement in Egypt as necessarily anti-imperialist, but they were sort of shocked, horrified, surprised to find that the media shut up and just said that they were a pro-Western movement. And if they were just a pro-Western movement, if they were what we thought that the Berlin Wall was, if they were just asking for sort of the world system to pour into the power vacuum, that might have worked. But because they actually were taking on existing structures in the region, it became much more difficult to sustain.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. Though it does raise serious questions about strategy. If you're in one of these countries, which can be so easily dominated, and to a certain extent makes us, I say us because I'm in Brazil, reliant on the global north and revolutionary change in the global north for things to really change. But I don't know if you have.
That's what Hassam says that at the end of the book, right? Because there's the two Egyptians that say, well, we need to ignore the global north. We've learned too many lessons from them. We need to do things entirely on our own. And then Hassam, who's one of the organizers in January in Egypt, he says, well, actually, it's only going to work if we are if we can somehow weaken or help carry out revolution in the global north anyway. So we can't really ignore that. But again, neither course of action is very easy. They're both quite daunting.
Yeah, so I mean, amidst all the disappointment, sometimes tragic disappointments, very bloody disappointments in the case of Syria, for example, Ukraine, and otherwise just kind of very serious kind of downturns in events, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, and a kind of, on the subjective side, probably the cultivation of a certain, people learning certain lessons, I guess, which is that, well, we can't have nice things, maybe, or that it's better not to ask for too much. And at any rate, there's going to be too much foreign infiltration and involvement. And maybe this is just the US trying to do whatever and manipulate us. And, you started off with the example that in Egypt, that people you tried to interview all warned that the other people you were interviewing were actually spies. So that, I think, really shines a light on the degree of suspicion that ends up being cultivated in the wake of failure and defeat. So I wonder what do you have a positive take home here? Or is that your point that, like, maybe, maybe all this protest thing isn't worthwhile?
Well, if it appears slightly pessimistic, or if it appears like we can't have nice things, I think it's because it's a book about tactics, right? And so if you're just looking at, because I build it around a particular type of response that gets very important in the 2010s. But if ultimately the lesson, and this is what a lot of, hundreds of people, the sort of reason that they sat down with me in the first place is because they believed in learning a lesson. But if one of the things that comes up out of these conversations is that there's a mismatch of tactics and goals, I think that an apparently pessimistic story becomes quite optimistic. Maybe not, automatic, in a teleological sense, like, oh, it's going to all work itself out on its own. I think that's a real mistake to make. But if indeed we're just dealing with a mismatch between tactics and goals, well, then that's not so hard to deal with. That is something that you can say, okay, that's the mountain that we can climb, but at least I know where it is. It's not so hard to do that. If there's the existing and demonstrable desire across the global system to change or improve it somehow or another, people are willing to take risks. People are willing to put their lives on the line. But there's just this lag that is, sociologically well established, that tactics sort of take a while to catch up with conditions across the history of human contention. Then I think the story becomes a lot more optimistic. Then what you have to do is just sort of learn from things and match responses to the ultimate goals. But I do think you have to also, at the same time, as Philip indicated earlier, be very, very careful about selecting your battles and selecting the moment for them. It doesn't make sense to pick a fight you're going to lose. And if you're not quite sure that you can improve things right now, then you should wait until you can. But we have lots of time. We have lots of time to wait for the next opportunity. I don't think it's so pessimistic. I think even the most like traumatized or the MPL, even like they were torn apart, but even like the most traumatized and disillusioned people are still like involved in some way or another in like attempts to improve the world. Because like, what else are you supposed to do with your life? Why not like learn from things and try to adjust to circumstances in a way that will make next time more successful.
Well, absolutely. And one line which one of your Egyptian interviewees says, reflecting back on the failure of the Arab Spring, we thought representation was elitism, but actually it's the essence of democracy. Well, that's very good. It's nice for him to say that because I want that on a banner. So
yeah,
I want that on a banner for the next wave of global protest.
Unless we're doing anarcho-primitivism, unless we're going back to bands of like 30, 40 people, there's going to be representation. So the question is whether or not we choose which type we're going to have.
Very good. All right. The books, If We Burn, I knew many of these cases, some of these cases, having followed them to various different degrees, but many of them I didn't. And having them all together here, not as kind of separate chunks, but as a kind of chronology and a story that's told, allows you to make these connections between these various different events, which it's hugely enlightening. And I would recommend listeners go and pick one up. The book's out now. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Vincent.
Thank you.